go time? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Really nice to see all of you from all over the place. It's been a little while for me. I thought I would start by saying that what brought me here today to want to give this talk was my own reflection about how much pain and suffering I've been in for the last good little while in recent times. So it's like Buddhism 101. You know, when suffering, like now what? And I've had sleepless nights, intense, extreme worry, just a lot of pain on all kinds of levels, personal, interpersonal, societal. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to try to figure out something about what this suffering is and how much of it is the one we get, the one that's our birthright, and how much of it is unnecessary. But before I get on to, before I move on, I thought I'd give you a question to ponder. Imagine you have just won 2 tickets or some number of tickets to go to Cambodia. And you would like to understand Cambodia better in order to prepare yourself for this trip. What are you going to do now, starting now, to prepare yourself for this trip? And I'm going to give you a couple, I'll give you a minute to sit and reflect on this. You may wish to write down some answers on a piece of paper if you have one. Would anyone here like to do some writing about this? I don't want to extend it forever, but if that would be helpful, then sure.
Okay.
I don't need to.
I don't know. I'm just thinking about it.
I really want you to imagine this. You're about to go to a foreign place. And you have an aspiration. You'd really like to know this place. You'd really like to understand it. You know ahead of time it's foreign. What are you going to do? How are you going to prepare? And so my hope in giving this talk this morning will be to see what happens from whatever you've come up with now, and see what happens at the end of my talk, because everything I'm about to say, my intention is to help us answer this question, perhaps in a different way than we did initially. So back to my own pain and my own pain and suffering. The more I've reflected on the source, I kept coming back to the idea of misunderstanding. That much of our pain comes from some misunderstanding or other. And then I immediately thought of Cool Hand Luke. What we have here is a failure to communicate. And I thought that would be my Dharma talk. And then I could just say, just go watch the movie and it'll all be clear. But I suppose this isn't a cinema, this is a Zen place of practice, so I ought to also offer some Zen wisdom. So let me start by reading an old Zen master speaking to one of his students. And he said, if one does not actually realize the truth of Zen from one's own experience, but simply learns it verbally and collects words and claims to understand Zen, how can one solve the riddle of life and death? If one does not actually realize the truth of Zen from one's own experience, how can one solve the riddle of life and death? And I think this points me to an abbreviated version which says we must have our own experience as step one. There's no alternative for us. The truth of Zen is our own experience. The second piece of this, therefore, is that knowledge does not equal understanding. And there's a lot of Zen masters that talked about this ad infinitum in our tradition, which is a common error many people make. Knowledge does not equal understanding. So what I've set up here so far is, to me, a realization that much of my pain and suffering, and I think a lot of pain and suffering that I see around us, comes from misunderstanding or misunderstandings of a certain kind. And that knowledge does not equal understanding. Then the next question for me is, what is understanding? What is understanding? What does it mean to understand something? way back in the day, I spent a lot of my time reading and thinking about the American writer David Foster Wallace. It's what I wrote my dissertation on. And it's interesting, but what he's most remembered for now, outside of his literary masterpieces, I think of as literary masterpieces, was a commencement speech that he gave at Kenyon College. And he started this commencement speech by offering a short little parable, which it's interesting now, I'm now in the position to read his parable in this context. But he wanted to offer the soon-to-be graduating seniors this framework for what he then said. He starts his talk by saying, there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit. And then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" What is our water? To what extent can you see yourself as the fish swimming around, who for the first time says, "What is water?" What would it take to do that? Translated, one way I can translate this parable for myself is to say, water is a kind of understanding that the fish have, which is equal to their practical attunement to the world, to their world. They have to have it. As fish, they have to be attuned to their fishbowl or their river or their ocean. They have to have some understanding of it, or else they wouldn't know what to do. Another way of saying this is that understanding, in some sense, is commonsensical. It's common sense to us. And here I think I'm going to get just a tiny little bit, maybe a little bit heady. But it's in distinction, I think it's important. That's important to consider. And I'll use an example from when I teach. For example, when I teach poetry, a common thing to ask students to do when you give them, say, a poem, from as a teacher, here's this poem. We say, okay, what does this mean? What does this poem mean, right? That's the exercise. We read it, what does it mean? And what I'm asking, or what the students think to do, is that they have to interpret this poem, right? We read it, here's this thing that's all of a sudden a weird thing, we don't quite know what the words mean, so we're going to read it, and then we're going to interpret it, and out of that interpretation, we will understand. And I think that is the normal, common sense way of approaching things. But I would like to propose to you that it's actually, from the Zen perspective, backwards. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, in order to even read the poem at all, in order to even begin trying to interpret it, we must already understand it in some shape or form. Understanding comes first. If we did not understand it to whatever extent, we couldn't even read it, let alone interpret it. So instead of thinking to ourselves that we interpret in order to understand, we actually understand in order to interpret. When Dogen talks about taking the backward step, this is to a large extent what he's talking about. Can you, in the act of being a fish swimming around, have some moment or have something to you happen where you have some sort of realization, though it's not really about realization, but the ability to step back and see, to whatever extent, that you're swimming in water, that you have some fundamental way of seeing the world. If you don't do this, if you don't take the backward step, you are like the fish who don't know what water is. How could they? If you do take Dogen's invitation to take the backward step, you'll then be able to ask the question, what the hell is water? And immediately, there's laid bare for us a trap. And I think this is common to what I would call the romantic idealization of Zen or Zen practice, which is this desire to somehow have a pure, unfiltered experience of the world. It's quite visible in a lot of older texts, but we see it in more cognitive sciencey ways today, and we label these things cognitive biases. There's a whole lot of them, logical fallacies, and what we in modern times try to do is say, okay, I have these, let me name all these biases, let me label them, and then let me just, get rid of them. But what would happen if the fish got rid of water? You can't do it, is maybe the more unpleasant truth. Well, it could be unpleasant, it doesn't have to be unpleasant, but the thought that we have these, call it ways of seeing the world, and we cannot set them aside despite our longing for kind of pure clarity on things, could be upsetting to us because we want to see clearly. So yet another way of saying this is that understanding shapes us more than we shape understanding. Understanding is the experience of our lives which to a large extent shapes us, creates us, and it cannot, and through no fault of our own, cannot have been otherwise. If you were born in, to use our example, Cambodia, you would speak Cambodian and you would understand that language. If you were born in Poland, as I was, you understand Polish by default. The fact that I, as a Polish speaker, cannot understand what the Cambodians are saying is not a fault of mine, nor is it the Cambodians' fault. It's just that we were born into two different modes of understanding. That shaped us through and through. And so Zen then asks us to take yet another radical step in trying to understand understanding. And Zen is the tradition that says mind and the world that we live in co-arise together. They are not separate. That's where a lot of the problems stem from. Good old Rene Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," which led Western philosophers off to some problematic conclusions. The Buddhists say, no, mind and our understanding, that which we are born into, co-arise. So in other words, it's less an individual practice than a social practice that we try to do. And what is it that Zen teaches us? Zen is the practice that tries to teach us how to work with the source of our own life, our own water, if you will, on our own. Here's the world you're thrown into. Here's the water you swim in. How are you going to understand it? So I have a rhetorical question, another one that's kind of a follow-up from the initial travel experiment. And I don't want to linger on this one for too long, but it was provocative for me, so I thought maybe it could be provocative for you. Imagine you've discovered a time machine and you go back many centuries ago to ancient China, where Zen is being cultivated and developed. And you see, when you get there, that your Zen teachers own slaves. The monks and the Zen teachers and your abbot are slave holders. How do you understand that? What would you say to them? I know what my lesser self would say, the one that can't take his own lessons, that can't live from the teachings. I would probably look at the Zen teacher and say, wait, don't you know that this Zen practice is all about freedom? And here you are owning slaves, and then I start getting all righteous. What kind of Zen teacher are you? Anyway. So, if my suffering has stemmed from to a large extent kinds of understandings, then I think it'd be worthwhile for me to offer what misunderstanding might actually be. What is it how do we define that, misunderstanding? And lucky for me, there's a really famous philosopher who did a lot of work on justice and virtue and defining these kinds of ideas, who I thought came up with a pretty good definition of misunderstanding. So I'd like to read it to you. It is a little bit wordy, so I'll go slow. Misunderstanding. When two distinct linguistic communities confront one another, each with its own body of canonical texts, its own exemplary images, and its own tradition of elaborating concepts in terms of these. But each also lacking a knowledge of the tradition of the other community, each will represent the belief of the other within its own discourse in abstraction from the relevant tradition. And so, in a way that ensures misunderstanding. When two distinct linguistic communities confront one another, each with its own body of canonical texts, its own exemplary images, and its own tradition of elaborating concepts in terms of these, but also lacking a knowledge of the tradition of the other community, each will represent the beliefs of the other within its own discourse in abstraction from the relevant tradition, and so in a way that ensures misunderstanding. From each point of view, certain of the key concepts and beliefs of the other, just because they are presented apart from that context of inherited texts from which they draw their conceptual life, will necessarily appear contextless and lacking in justification. So, I know that's a lot, and I'm sure it's possibly hard to understand in the abstract. So let me try to clarify a little bit this way. Interpretation is not necessarily acquiring information about what is understood. That's that example of students with a poem. Rather, think of it this way. if you're trying to interpret something that's puzzling you, what you're trying to do is to work out the possibilities projected in your own understanding. The backward step is the practice of coming to know what we have understood. And what we understand, our own water, are certain kind of, it's a certain set of limits. If we really begin to understand our own understanding, we will see more clearly the limits that we have. And this is great news for Buddhist practitioners, because our teachings remind us over and over again that this practice is relational, contextual, and impermanent, which are all characters and traits of the human mind. This is what we talk about when we talk about emptiness. In other words, in yet other words, our practice based on impermanence, on dependent origination, on no self, tells us there is always more to something than we can initially see. And so this is where we get back to what I said a little bit earlier about we still, as human beings, I'll speak for myself, have this romantic ideal view that I could get outside of my own limitations and just see things clearly. And I'm pretty good at asking questions and doing the work of like, okay, how about this? How about that? But I think the more fundamental practice step is to see that truthful interpretation revolves around, it's not about avoiding projections and preconceptions, but rather in our own critical appraisal of our own projections and preconceptions and confirmations. How can we notice our own inappropriate projections so they can be revised and replaced by better ones? This is hard work. This first, I'm swimming in water. Okay. Oh, well, that's that's shocking. But then this act of act of having cultivated curiosity, asking why. Why is this person so upset? Why is this person acting in this way? And you can start to maybe notice analogous features between your own understanding and whatever the understanding of this other person might be. I call it critical work, which is hard to do. Probably because at the root of it, whenever things become homogeneous and everybody tends to have the same understanding as you do, you begin to be like the fish that nobody anymore has, over the generations, or no, the fish, because they all swim in the same understanding, they lose the capacity to ask the question, what is water? And after enough generations go by, it takes, the old wise fish to happen to swim by to remind them, oh, because who else is going to ask it from within the community if everybody already has the same understanding? But there's something really annoying about the old wise fish. And painful. Really painful. Which is why I would call it hard work to do this kind of thing. And so I think the bad news from my talk is that seems like, well, if we misunderstand one another continually, we're destined to have a lot of pain. And I think when I look around my world, I see just heaps and heaps of it. But then if we say, okay, let me do the work to try to understand my own understanding, that's also guaranteed to cause a lot of discomfort. Because you're going to find out things that don't necessarily align with your own world. And so that initial question I asked you all to sit with, we're going to Cambodia. What are you going to do to better prepare yourself for that trip? To better understand Cambodia. And before really thinking about this stuff, I came up with answers like learn Cambodian and buy some travel guides, look at maps, have an open mind going in. Where I think the most succinct way I could now give the answer is, what I would do to better understand Cambodia is I would go to a bookstore and buy a book on American history. Because by buying a book about, say, American history, I would better understand my own understanding, my own place of relative departure. I would have a better sense of what filters I'm bringing to Cambodia. If I can't better understand myself, all I would do in Cambodia while traveling is project my own understandings onto them and interpret everything through my own lens, my own filters, and I would entirely miss whatever it is that the Cambodians are about. Because I would be too blind about my own stuff. I would just take it for granted. So I think my conclusion here for us is that it seems to be the case that misunderstanding causes pain. But there are things we could do to ease that pain. Reflecting on our own worldviews, the ones that we have already concluded are correct or remain invisible to us. That's step one. And in a more perhaps expansive way, we could ask ourselves via this route, what values do we hold dear? And then, if we're bold enough, what values might somebody else not like me hold dear? So I'm curious to hear from you how that, what resonates with you about understanding.
So one question I had was, at one point you said our teaching, our Zen teaching, leads us to the conclusion that we can never initially see all the pieces. And my question is, do we ever? I mean, initially I agree with you completely, but is it possible? Or is it, I guess so, possible.
I don't think it's possible.
Mm.
And I think that's what makes human life and our limitations so painful to us. Because we continue to hope. Joko Beck talks about this all the time, some versions of hope. I think really in the end, what we're always hoping for somewhere down, is some view from nowhere that is infinite and knows and can see everything. But unfortunately, that's not our fate. So as usual, I think it's somewhere the middle way is the way, between saying, well, because I'm so limited, I guess I'm just going to get comfortable in my own limited views and just speak as though those limited views are everything. And I think that way lies all the kind of small forms of bigotry and hatred and, my view is the correct view. But then on the other side, you have well, since I can't understand everything, I'm just gonna be passive and just give up, right? Still swallowed up in emptiness side of the ditch. And what's left for us as Zen practitioners, I think, is this aspiration to keep showing up, knowing we're limited in our views, we won't ever truly understand everything, but to continue taking the backward step over and over and over again. Here's my understanding. Here's the place of departure I'm coming from. Here are the filters I have on. Here's the color sunglasses I'm wearing. Okay, given that I'm wearing these orange sunglasses, this is how I'm seeing the world. Maybe is that person wearing the same color? What if they're wearing green? Okay, so now orange and green I'm the green, I'm the orange. How's the world look to you? And then critical conversation can happen. We don't need perfection for that. It's okay. Orange glasses are.
Thank you.
Two people.
Okay, so let's see. So who's next?
Becky.
Becky. Do I have to
No.
Okay.
So good to see you again.
Good.
As soon as I saw you, I felt all of the Dharma talks that I've heard from you before and go, oh, good, I'm so glad he's here today. Yes. And I really thank you for starting it from your experience of suffering and looking for where where the ability that you have to soften the suffering in some circumstances and to figure out what those are to go with. Understanding, yes. I mean, it's an interesting word to start out with, is the idea that standing under something is a way to to have some sense of it. But because that's like the root meaning of it is literally standing under. And so, of course, it's all about our perspective and all the ways that you are offering and that we explore to recognize it, to not be caught in it when we want to be open to another person. And yes, to recognize that we never will have boundless perspective, but boundless mind. And that's what's going on. So I just thank you so much. One of the other things in that, though, is that we can't learn it as information. It must be our experience. And I laugh every time that we do the chant about what is it, merging or something like that. Anyway, the last thing says, I humbly say to those who study the mystery, don't waste time. But when I once read it after having heard it several times, what I heard and laughed was that we don't study it, that we let ourselves be in rather than studying the mystery. So anyway, thank you so much.
We have Jessica.
Did I start with the sound of a rooster? I think so. Good morning. Thank you so much for this talk. It brought up a lot for me, and I guess I'm wanting to kind of process out loud with you. I recently had this experience of realizing that I was projecting, like severely projecting. Can you still hear me okay? There's a lot going on in the background. Okay. It was so painful, this realization. It kind of annihilated my worldview, and I don't know that I did anything to have this happen other than maybe it's just a side effect of practice. And it was so painful that I think I dipped in for a little while. And now I'm back to projecting probably. So I think what I'm kind of chewing on is, it seems to be about titration, maybe, like little bits at a time in order for me to see through my own projection. And then also capacity to sit with and be with the fact that I do that and the pain that brings. So I don't know if that opens anything up. I just wanted to see what you might say to that.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. You're talking about, of course, skillful means. And that's why I think you're wise to suggest that if it's true, if anything what I said is even half true, then we, like the fish who realize they're swimming in water, jumping out of it is not the way. But how do we meet somebody in a different body of water? And if you jump out of your own entirely, you'll die. And it's just too painful. But the skillful tool that we have, the way I understand Zazen, is in an instrumental way anyway, is the practice which allows us to notice over and over and over again with curiosity our own understandings. so that we can tolerate an alternate understanding just a little bit more. That's the promise of Zazen anyway, that I return to sometimes when I'm frustrated by my own limitations.
Thank you so much.
And we have Cersei.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Yes, thank you so much for this really heartfelt talk and a thought-provoking talk, and just that you, I agree with Becky that you really started it from a vulnerable place, and I think it helped us all connect with the power of what you're saying. I, of course, can't hear a Zen talk without thinking through the lens of anthropology, since that is something that has utterly shaped me for the last 30-something years. But one of the things I was really struck by that's a kind of another piece of what you're talking about is that, you know, we can think about the Cambodian example as this encounter with difference, right? And it's sort of the extreme version of cultural, religious, social difference, like we're imagining this other. And for us as anthropologists who do that, have that encounter with difference as a way of living, right? One of the things that happens is when you approach that difference, you see yourself more clearly. Like your lens comes into focus in the encounter. So anthropologists don't go approach difference and say, I have all the understanding and I'm going to impose my way of understanding on you. You see your own biases, your water that you're swimming in because you've encountered somebody who's not in the water, right? And so I think that the reason why I'm bringing that up is that we can think about the Cambodian example as this sort of, it's so much easier to see what we're swimming in because they're swimming in something else, right? But we have that difference, you know, of all sorts all around us all the time here, you know, in our everyday worlds. And so I think that sometimes because it might be a little closer to us, it's harder for us to do the exact same thing. But we see ourselves when we allow ourselves to actually to work through it. So I think about, for instance, political differences that I'm encountering in my own family. My family is, well, mostly Trump supporters, and I am not. But if I don't sit and encounter that, I don't see my own biases. I don't see, you know, all the things that are shaping me. I can't even sit at the table with them if I don't sit in where we're coming from and the value systems that shape us. So, and it's true, you know, not just politically, but in terms of religion, in terms of everything. So I guess I just wanted to say that who we are and our values come into greater clarity in the encounter rather than avoiding it. That's my so I guess I'm adding, I'm not asking, but I just wanted to bring that to the table if that's okay.
And we have Norma.
Am I unmuted? Yes? Okay. Do we stop at 12, like in 2 minutes? Yes?
It's up to the timekeeper.
Okay. Because I have a couple of slightly complicated stories. Let me just say first, I saw you were going to speak. I put it on my calendar in big red letters, I don't know, a month ago, whenever I first realized that. So looking forward. And fulfilled in my expectations. In the mid 1990s, I was teaching in a social work school and got recruited to teach a racism class. And so that was a huge lesson in what you're talking about how we see through these societally developed lenses. In 1974, I signed up for the Eureka School. It is a mystical school that completely dismantles your understandings, your normal understandings. There's lectures, there's meditation, there's physical exercise, there's lots of stuff, 40 days. And I remember telling my best friend afterwards, I am not normal anymore. I just got lifted out. In a short way, you could say, I ended up more or less believing in reincarnation. And then after listening to your talk, I'm thinking, God, do I have to give that up too? It's like an understanding. But there was something about bringing all of that to the realm of Zen practice that was, I don't know, kind of thrilling. So I just want to say great appreciation for your talk and about your personal situation of feeling all of this pain. You know, I'm just sending as much love and compassion as I can over these airways. So thank you.
Okay.